The Australian Financial Review.
Good morning, this is Angela. It's just before 7 o'clock and I'm just checking the app for the National Electricity Market just to see what the energy mix is for the power grid at the moment.
When I asked senior reporter Angela Macdonald-Smith whether Australia was on track to meet its 2030 climate targets, she opened an app on her phone.
Obviously, the sun isn't up yet, so coal is doing most of the heavy lifting. 65.5% of the power at the moment is on the grid.
This real-time snapshot of the national energy market first thing in the morning showed we have a very long way to go in a short period of time to kick our coal habit. Just over a year ago, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Energy Minister Chris Bowen announced the country's new climate targets.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Well, today, Australia turns the climate corner.
They committed to cutting emissions by 43% and moving 82% of the national energy market to renewables by the end of the decade.
For years, the Australian government told the world that it was all too hard, told Australians that it was too hard. Well, the Albanese government today sends a very different message. We send a message to the workers in traditional...
But now there are doubts about whether Australia can get there in time. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, Angela Macdonald-Smith and senior writer Ben Potter on the mammoth task ahead to re-engineer the country's power system, why we are unlikely to meet those 2030 climate targets, and how we can get back on track to reach net zero by 2050. It's Thursday, July 20. Hi Angela, hi Ben. It's a really good time for us to be having this discussion about our climate targets and whether we can meet them given the extreme heat waves we have in the US and also in Europe and the floods in South Korea. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Lisa.
Excited to be here, Lisa.
Angela, can you explain exactly what the climate targets are? And while we have a long way to go, and that's what this podcast is about, how far have we come? How much of the grid is now powered by renewables?
Yes, well, the targets were put in place by the Albanese government last year after they came to power. And that's that by 2030, 82% of the electricity that we use every year would be supplied by renewable energy. And the other part of that target is that carbon emissions would be down by 43% by 2030 from a baseline that's set from 2005. You've got to remember that both of those are actually basically designed to actually get us on the pathway to net zero emissions by 2050. We have made good progress, though. Renewables in 2021 accounted for 29% of the power system across the whole of the country. And that's up from 8% in 2000 and about 15% in 2015. So it is going fast. But at the same time, as we stand today, despite all of that investment and all those big renewable projects going up, coal still makes up the bulk of the power system. So I'm looking at this app that the energy market operator puts out, and it shows just exactly how electricity is actually being generated at the moment, from which fuels it's coming from. And you can see that right now, coal makes up 60% of the fuel mix. We've got solar on about 16% and wind at 10.6%, and then other fuels as well.
So you can see that at any point of the day in real time?
That's right. It changes every 5 minutes. It's all built from the data coming out from the energy market operator. But look, at 7 o'clock this morning, just before the sun came up, I had a look, and coal at that time was 65 to 67%. Obviously, there was no solar at that point. Gas was actually a lot higher, and there's also a bit of wind. But a few days ago, for example, we had a beautiful sunny winter day here, and coal was actually just down to about 50%. So it does move around, but you've still got coal providing half, if not more, of all electricity generated in the national market at the moment.
And that's the problem right there on that app, isn't it? The sun is not always shining. The wind is not always blowing, and we need what is called firming capacity. I want you to explain what firming capacity is and also outline the other big challenges in achieving those 2030 targets.
Sure. Well, firming capacity is obviously critical. It really does fill in the gap we've got so much of the power coming from renewables, weather-dependent, wind and solar, then if we have what's called a wind drought, so a few days without wind, or even if just a big cloud or a storm comes over and you get less solar power, you have to have something that you can instantaneously switch to. And that basically is firming power. So that's either batteries, lithium-ion batteries, gas power, or pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is a sort of type of big water battery, really, in a way. And as we get more renewables, we really need to have more of that firming capacity in place to actually complement the weather dependency of the rest of the power system. And then, of course, we've got to have a completely new sort of way of getting energy from where it's generated to where it's used. The system was originally designed around these centralised power stations. Of course, we had these regions such as Latrobe Valley in Victoria, we had Hunter Valley here in New South Wales. And the power was generated there, and these big transmission lines would actually take it to where it's needed in the cities, and then smaller distribution lines to the local households. But renewables is completely different. Where the concentration of those plants, those wind and solar plants, are typically in, like, for example, northwest Victoria, where it's very sunny, western New South Wales also. So you've got no longer this centralised system. You've got power coming in from all sorts of different regions and having to get to where it needs to go. And that requires a complete reworking of the transmission system.
And Lisa, to do that, we need to build 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines just this decade. To put that in context, if you circumnavigate Australia in a car, you will drive about 15,000 kilometres. All of these things, renewables projects, firming capacity and transmission lines, have to happen in tandem to meet those 2030 targets.
Yes, that's right. The whole grid has to change, and that's something that's been picked up on in particular by Frank Calabria.
No matter which way you look at it, the scale of the change over this decade will be truly staggering.
That's the Origin Energy CEO, who's singled out transmission as probably the biggest hurdle to the transition.
In transmission, major projects covering the 10,000 kilometres need to be built as quickly as possible, because without that, the ability to connect new renewable energy supply and storage to the grid is compromised.
So Ben, I want to go to you now, because we need all of these transmission lines, but it's not just a matter of putting up the towers and stringing the lines together. There are huge logistical issues, and there's also a lot of opposition from local landowners where these towers and lines have to go up. You've just been on a road trip to regional Victoria to talk with farmers. Can you tell us about their concerns and what that means for the state governments trying to build the infrastructure that is so necessary for this energy transition?
That's right, Lisa. We're talking about a re-engineering of a modern industrial economy, really on the scale of another industrial revolution. It's a massive undertaking. Trying to do it in a couple of decades. We know the climate wars cost us a decade or two in that, so now we're playing catch-up. And the challenge is nowhere starker than in the regions. As you mentioned, I went on a trip through sort of heading northwest from Melbourne towards Ballarat, then north of Ballarat to Wedderburn. And it was really interesting to talk to a lot of the farmers who are in the path of these proposed 500 kilovolt transmission towers. Those towers are needed to transport the new wind and solar energy that's being built to where it needs to go. These regions are also hosting pretty much all of this large-scale wind and solar generation, apart from the transmission towers. And we do need to have the farmers on board. And they kind of fear that what's now being proposed is only the start of 2 decades of really rolling out a lot of this infrastructure across the countryside. And they're kind of right to fear that, because we do need vast increases in our wind and solar generation and transmission capacity.
And so as you were out there talking to people, what were their main issues with the lines being on their properties?
Look, they complain of poor consultation.
If it was for the greater good and it was a legitimate project and you could see a benefit in it, I'd say yes.
So I spoke to 2 farmers only about an hour's drive northwest of Melbourne, Emma and Peter Muir.
But knowing how badly and how they've lied and cheated and AMO have just bulldozed their way through this, it makes me fight more to say no. You do it, if you're going to do it properly.
Mm-hmm. Peter Muir's family has been farming in this area since the mid-19th century, and they've been very heavily involved in the sort of putting the farmer's case for the last 3 years.
These families along here will, I hate to say it, but they will fight to the death, won't they? They will blockade them. It will be very, very nasty.
So they're talking in quite confrontational terms. Probably the issue that will resonate with most Australians is the concern of these farmers about the impact on their ability to fight fires from these very high towers and very wide easements of 90 metres or so. We spoke to a farmer called Tom Drife, who farms at a place called Glendarrell north of Ballarat. He's also been a member of his local Country Fire Authority branch for 20-odd years.
And you'll have a fire on such a scale that it gets really hard to put out then. But with the power line in place, we would just have to have let them run.
Yeah. He told us that their branch has pulled up 5 big fires that came off some nearby mountains over the last 20 years on the easement of the Western Renewables Link, which is where there are going to be restrictions on fighting those fires when these towers are built. So he called it a life and death issue.
The fire issue is actually life and death. People are going to die. Eventually someone dies.
Yeah.
And we're going to hold people responsible for it too.
Then we also spoke to Ewan Ferguson, who is an ex-chief officer of the Victorian Country Fire Authority. He said that
the lack of a coherent response around fire management is just startling.
Now, having said that, AusNet and Transmission Company Victoria say that they're very conscious of the fire risk and concerns that farmers have about fighting fires.
At the end of the day, the landowner is still going to bear that responsibility. So the question is, who is going to take the responsibility for increased fire risk?
But that's an unresolved issue.
So are the farmers being compensated, and is it enough?
Well, I guess, Lisa, that remains to be seen. So there is the $200,000 per kilometre of land traversed compensation that emerged in the last year, really, that is paid over, I think it's 20 years in New South Wales, 25 years in Victoria. So they're quite dismissive of that. It turns out to be quite a small annual payment. But in addition to that, in Victoria, they will be compensated for loss of value to their properties that they can attribute to the power lines. And this does appear to be happening. And then there are payments for loss of income for so-called special value, which is really if you can prove that there's some quite unusual use of your property. So it does seem that there are quite a lot of categories of compensation on offer, but it's going to take years of negotiation for that to be worked through.
And I'd just probably point out also, Lisa, that that's just the Victorian problems. So we've got similar sorts of local battles also playing out elsewhere across the market, in particular in New South Wales, with some key transmission lines there that are also needed for the transition.
So, Angela, there's the huge challenge of building enough transmission lines to connect renewables to the grid, and there's the local opposition. But you also mentioned the issue of firming capacity and the important backup role that pumped hydro will play. Can you explain to us exactly how pumped hydro projects work, as we don't follow it as closely as you? And can you also give us an update of the troubled Snowy 2.0 project in New South Wales, which was supposed to be the Great Hope?
Yeah, sure, Lisa. Well, with pumped hydro, it's really a big water battery. So you've got 2 water reservoirs quite close to each other, but at different heights. And then when water from the top reservoir is pumped down through pipelines and then through a power station at the bottom to actually generate power. And then when you've got surplus electricity, typically in the middle of the daytime, all of those renewables, then you use that to actually pump the water back up different pipelines to the top reservoir. So you've got this sort of circular sort of loop of water flow that actually generates electricity when it's needed on the way down. It's interesting because pumped hydro actually typically uses more power than it actually generates. But the important thing is when it's happening. It really can just come on instantaneously, just when the market really needs it to happen. It's a huge engineering challenge to build, sort of kilometres worth of tunnels deep underground. And, especially in this day and age, you've got, COVID, we've got supply problems, etc. Snowy Hydro has really had a very difficult time to make that happen. So Snowy 2.0 is running at least 2 years late. When it was first talked about by then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, the indication was that it would cost $2 billion, but actually now it's already up to $5.9 billion in the formal budget. And actually, some say it will end up costing closer to $10 billion. But Lisa, Snowy 2.0 is just one of a complex web of projects that need to be managed to help to reach our energy targets. We are an energy-intensive economy. For example, if we look at Tomago, an aluminium smelter in Newcastle, that's the country's biggest electricity user. Snowy 2.0 would only be able to run the entire smelter for 2 weeks. So to get to where we want to go by 2030, we need not just one, but the equivalent of 8 Snowy 2.0 projects in place, according to some estimates. That troubled Snowy 2.0 project is just another red flag for whether we can meet those ambitious 2030 goals. And here's the thing, Lisa, we're only getting new renewable projects connected to the power grid at half the rate that we need to hit those climate targets.
Gas isn't just a transition fuel, it's a fuel in transition. Biomethane and green hydrogen using renewable electricity are just 2 types of renewable gas being demonstrated and produced around Australia, helping create safe and reliable energy options for homes, businesses and industry. Find out how renewable gas can support Australia's energy transition at gorenewablegas.com.au.
Hi, I'm Eddie Maguire. This is Brownlow medalist, Premiership superstar Jimmy Bartell, also a board member of GWS. Isn't it a conflict of interest?
Conflicts of everywhere, and I think you and I might have a few conflicts if you keep going that way. Make sure you join us every Monday because we will talk about all the big issues that you want to hear about, the fans.
And we want you to get involved as well. It's Eddie and Jimmy on the podcast. Richard is our producer. Richard, how do you find us, mate?
Subscribe to Eddie and Jimmy wherever you get your podcasts.
The podcast is sponsored by Ladbrokes. What are you really gambling with?
So, Ben and Angela, from what you have said, we are running well behind schedule to get enough renewable projects hooked up to the grid to reach those 2030 targets. You've talked about transmission lines and the difficulties faced by big projects like Snowy Hydro. What else is slowing the energy transition down?
Yes, well, Ben's obviously talked about all of the problems with approvals for transmission. You've got very sort of heavy regulatory burdens also for transmission companies that are seeking approvals. And then, once that's in place, you've got to get the materials, the cables, the specialist labour needed to actually build it. And look, you've got to remember that, pretty much all of the developed world is actually trying to do this at the same time too. So it's pretty hard to get hold of some of these things, and we are sort of at the end of the world, as it were. So Federal Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen has said that to meet the targets, we need to install 22,500-watt solar panels every day for 8 years, along with 40 wind turbines every month. But we're actually quite some way off that. I'd also like to point out that actually all this conversation so far has pretty been about supply, but we also have to think about the demand side. And even though over the last probably about 10 years or so, electricity demand across the national electricity market has been pretty much flat, if not actually sort of softened a little bit. But that's all set to change with this trend towards electrification that we're seeing everywhere. It's not just, more electric vehicles, it's, factories and industries trying to electrify also just to be able to cut their emissions more effectively. So we've had, 10 years of electricity going down, but actually the energy market operator is now forecasting that just on the national electricity market alone, demand's going to double by 2050.
One of the overarching issues, I think, has been a lack of sufficient urgency. Obviously, we talked about the climate wars slowing us down, but we also talked about the scale of the challenge. Some energy bosses talk about a kind of post-World War II reconstruction effort being required to deal with the energy transition. And that's really government and industry working together to try and really shift the dial on re-engineering large parts of the productive economy. Angela talked about batteries, the fact that typically at the moment the duration of their storage is inadequate to make a big difference to major industrial demand on the grid. Batteries have also been expensive, and that's discouraged households and small businesses from putting them in their systems. We've also been slow to embrace offshore wind, but because of our unique geography, we should have tremendous potential for offshore wind. We've been very slow to adopt electric vehicles, partly because of political discouragement of electric vehicles, partly because living in a very large country with long driving distances when you head out of the cities, there's been concern about the range. That's improving.
So what does all this mean for Australia's timetable for switching off coal?
Well, coal power obviously needs to be phased out to meet our emissions reduction targets. And you've got to remember that these coal plants, most of them are sort of 40, 50 years old already. They're just quite decrepit, increasingly unreliable. We saw that in last winter's grid crisis on the East Coast. And, many of the companies that own them, particularly if they're listed companies, are under huge pressure from shareholders and customers to shut coal plants down as soon as possible. So that's, AGL and Origin. We've got AGL's biggest shareholder now is tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes. So he's, putting particular pressure on AGL to accelerate its exit from coal power. We've already seen Liddell, that's one of the AGL plants in the Hunter Valley. Liddell closed in April, and AGL's also had to bring forward closure dates for its other two main power stations. The next major one to close is Origin's Eraring. That's on the New South Wales Central Coast. That's actually the country's biggest power generator, provides about a quarter of the state's power. And that's due to close in August 2025. Origin brought that closure date forward by 7 years just quite recently. But now this huge debate is to actually what will happen if that power plant is allowed to close, both in terms of security of electricity supply, but also on prices. And, the energy market operators also saying that basically, even though we've got a third of the coal capacity due to close by 2030 so far, that actually the deteriorating economics of those plants mean that it might be 2/3 that exit. You've got to remember, I think, also just what happened when the last big power station closed, the one before Liddell, that's Hazelwood, back in Victoria in 2017. That caused a real spike in prices for consumers that really we've never gone back to the pre-Hazelwood closure prices.
The other point here is that coming up with a transitional plan for coal closures and doing it in a more coherent way is something that was resisted for a long time. And as a result, there was a lack of planning and foresight. And Hazelwood, which did cause a big spike in prices, was closed on 6 months' notice by the French company Engie, which had a change of policy dictated from Paris. So at least now we have minimum notice periods for closing coal-fired power stations, and that helps. But we did suffer from having a lack of planning around that issue back when Hazelwood closed in 2017.
So, Ben, if we are to meet our targets for switching off coal and meet our important 2030 targets, what needs to change? How can we turn this around and keep the energy transition on track?
Well, Lisa, it looks as if we are running a couple of years behind schedule, and that's a problem. Approvals for especially major transmission projects that traverse hundreds of farmers or landowners' land are just really hard. There's a variety of things that can be done to smooth that path. There is compensation for landowners that can be tweaked, as we saw last year. Some sort of streamlining of approvals may help. Then there are some potential game changers down the track. Offshore wind should click in the early 2030s. That's obviously past our 2030 targets, but we do expect it will play a significant role beyond that.
I'd say that one reason for optimism is really just the amount of capital that's available to actually be thrown into this. We've seen that with some of the corporate action that's going on at the moment in the Australian energy market. So you've got the proposed takeover of Origin Energy by the Canadian giant Brookfield. They want to spend $20 billion in the next 10 years to build out renewables. Then you've got Andrew Forrest and his private company, Squadron Energy. They've also got a $20 billion plan to build out renewables. And you've got AGL as well, cancelled its demerger last year, but now it does have big plans to join up with partners and also invest in clean energy. So there's really no shortage of capital and funding to make it happen, and that's really something positive.
You're both reporting on this closely and have been for a number of years now. Do you think there's any way we can hit the 2030 targets? And given the optimistic tone you've just taken in the answer to the last question in terms of the potential for offshore wind and the private capital that's available, what about our net zero ambitions for 2050? Can we get there?
Lisa, I think with the 2050 ambition, the bottom line on that is that we have to get there. You mentioned at the start of the podcast the brutal kind of temperatures and other weather indicators of climate change that are being seen accelerating from the polar ice caps melting to the terribly hot weather that we're seeing in places like southern Italy as well as the southwest states of the United States, Texas and so on. That does increase pressure. We saw what happened in 2020 after we had the terrible summer of bushfires, that it did kind of intensify the pressure on the political system to accelerate the climate effort. So I think 2050 is something that has to happen, and if we don't get there, then humanity will be in trouble. 2030 is obviously only 6.5 years away, which is a pretty small amount of time when you're trying to change a massive industrial system. So it looks as though those targets are going to be pushed out a couple of years or a few years, as we said. It is worth mentioning here that every complex economy, from the most sophisticated industrial economies such as Germany, are struggling with this transition, and they didn't even have a climate war. So it is a really tough thing to get done. But there are, as we mentioned, some reasons to be optimistic for the medium to long term. Angela mentioned all the capital lining up. It's also in the nature of industrial revolutions. They tend to move slowly at first as the technology is going out and then getting adopted. Word gets around and they start to move quickly when people find out that it's working. Humanity isn't very good at predicting these kinds of disruptive change because our brains evolved in a completely different era when man-made technology didn't really change the way we lived very rapidly. But at some stage, you've got to expect that all the moving parts of the transition that we've been talking about will start to come together and click, and things should begin to move more rapidly. That looks as though that will be late, maybe later this decade or early next decade. That should give us cause for optimism in the medium to longer term.
Yes, I'd agree with Ben that 2030 is really looking so close now. It's really hard to see that we're going to get to those targets. And I would say that more and more sort of serious players that I speak to, that's the CEOs of both the energy producers, but also importantly, the energy consumers, are starting to voice more openly their doubts about meeting the 2030 targets. There's Rystad Energy Consultancy. They're actually saying that we're on track to be more like 64% renewables by 2030 rather than 82%. So that would indicate that unless something really changes, and pretty quickly too, that it's going to take a few more years longer to get to the 82%. But I would add that, look, it's really good to have ambitious 2030 targets. We need to have that desire and that end game. And look, really, and it's just a one step on the path to net zero by 2050, which is a pretty ambitious but absolutely necessary goal. So we really just need to move as fast as we can there. And I think what's going to be important is just getting everyone on side, government, industry, and the actual consumers themselves to actually make the changes necessary and find the solutions to get there.
Let's hope we can do that. Thanks, Angela. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks for having us, Lisa.
Gas isn't just a transition fuel, it's a fuel in transition. Biomethane and green hydrogen using renewable electricity are just two types of renewable gas being demonstrated and produced around Australia, helping create safe and reliable energy options for homes, businesses and industry. Find out how renewable gas can support Australia's energy transition at gorenewablegas.com.au.
Be confident that your child is safe, secure and comfortable with a Britax Safe and Sound Be First Click-Tight car seat. For 0 to 4 years, it's fast, easy and secure. The Safe and Sound Be First Click-Tight car seat from Britax.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week. The British government says it is up to Australia to sort out the crisis caused by the Victorian government's shock decision to pull out of hosting the 2026 Commonwealth Games. Victorian Premier Dan Andrews has come under fire for his decision, but said it was not a hard one to make because estimated costs have more than doubled to $7 billion. And Matilda's jerseys have already outstripped the amount of Socceroos kits sold around the 2022 Qatar World Cup, according to Nike. The Matildas, who take on Ireland in the opening game of the FIFA Women's World Cup in Sydney on Thursday, have used Australia's status as co-host to call out the discrepancy in male and female prize money. The $230 million for this year's event is much higher than in 2019, but it remains well short of the $645 million that was given to the Men's World Cup in Qatar. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Angela Macdonald-Smith and Ben Potter reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the podcast and want to hear more, consider sharing it or writing a review, as it helps us reach more people. And follow us wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.
Gas isn't just a transition fuel. It's a fuel in transition. Biomethane and green hydrogen using renewable electricity are just two types of renewable gas being demonstrated and produced around Australia, helping create safe and reliable energy options for homes, businesses and industry. Find out how renewable gas can support Australia's energy transition at gorenewablegas.com.au.
The safe and sound Be-Grow Click-Tight car seat from Britax grows with your child from 6 months up to 8 years with advanced side impact cushion technology and installation that's fast, easy and secure. The Be-Grow Click-Tight car seat, britax.com.au.
What do you see on the horizon? Uncertainty or opportunity? Whatever you see, at PGIM we can help you rise to the challenges of today when active investing and disciplined risk management are needed most. Drawing on deep expertise across the world's public and private markets in pursuit of long-term returns, PGIM, our investments shape tomorrow today. Start the pursuit of your tomorrow together with PGIM, a leading global asset manager.